It is not often that you see an MLB owner meet with the media midseason, but Steve Cohen is not your typical MLB owner. We learned a ton from Cohen on Wednesday as he broke down everything as it relates to this very frustrating season for the New York Mets. And I'll be giving you my 5 big takeaways from Cohen's press conference on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We learned a lot from Steve Cohen on Wednesday. I have 5 big takeaways to dive into, but before I really get into them, and we'll talk about another Mets loss in the final segment, I want to focus on the big news of the day, which was Cohen's comments. But the accountability that he showed to meet with the media in the first place is something that we never would have seen from the Wilpons, which is refreshing. He shares in the frustration of Mets fans. It's obvious. Probably feels it more than a lot of us as a diehard fan that's also losing money hand over fist, trying to bring a winner to this fan base, to this franchise. And this season has been an abject failure. It just has been. But I think what we learned today was, one, where this franchise is going and the fact that it's still in steady hands despite an awful season, and a really realistic outlook on what's going on. So let's just dive right into my 5 takeaways, which I did write about at justbaseball.com. So you can read this on the site as well. I'll obviously go a little more at length now on the show, but I watched the whole thing and typed out my thoughts, and now I'll speak them to you a little bit. But the first thing that was clear, and not really a huge takeaway because we knew it yesterday when Billy Epler met with the media, so there's no firings that are happening here, right? You're not going to see Billy Epler canned or Buck Showalter. He definitively said when asked, does this mean that Buck Showalter and Billy Epler will have jobs through the remainder of the season? He said absolutely. Looked right at the reporter into the camera and said, absolutely, they're not going anywhere. Okay, so that takes that off the table. And that takes, in some respects, the blame off of the table. While when you do kind of the autopsy of the season at the end of the year, those conversations could change, but not right now. And in particular, I felt like there was not necessarily a vote of confidence on Billy Epler running baseball operations, but the idea that it's not always going to be on Epler to run those operations, but he might still be the GM. And that's my biggest takeaway from this press conference is David Stearns is, I don't want to say likely, but will be strongly considered to be the president of baseball operations for the Mets. And if I'm reading the tea leaves from today, I feel like it's going to happen. It's going to happen because he's going to get paid a massive bag of cash. Not to mention wanting to, run the New York Mets as a native New Yorker. But what Steve Cohen spoke about a lot in this press conference, and this is the part of it that can get you a little bit excited about the future before we get into the bad, which is the players and the onus on them and the responsibility and what's left of this season and the really dwindling time the Mets have. What you have to look forward to is a franchise that has been getting resources poured into player development, to building a pitching lab, to being able to have an infrastructure in place that could be self-sufficient and can over time consistently churn out winners. Now, they got to do it. They got to prove that they can make it all work. But what Cohen craves is an executive that can take things over, that has the pedigree and the experience to come in and be one of the brightest minds in the game, and to get one of those people into his building, because he knows he's competing with Alex Anthopoulos in this division, who inherited a fine, tooled machine in an incredible developmental program the Braves have. Let's just be honest. A tradition of winning, and then he's one of the best baseball minds that you have. And here they have this self-sufficient franchise with all these young players on good deals. They make the right trades, everything that a team would want to be in baseball. And the Mets want to become a model franchise. To get there, Cohen sees getting that mind in as a top priority. And part of what he said about keeping Epler and Showalter is the idea that you don't want to be reactionary. You don't want to seem like you're this reactionary owner who already had a little bit of a bad stain on him for tweeting too much, to be the guy that fires Buck Showalter because the fans are telling you to. And I was one of them, certainly. So for him, it's let's preach patience and stability in this time. And I think also let's not fire one of David Stern's friends who could potentially work under him as the GM. And he spoke about the type of guy that he wants, someone with that experience, and the fact that you can't just hire them. One of the big quotes that he says, in my industry, essentially, the financial industry, what he does with his hedge fund, it's easier to acquire whatever talent you want, because honestly, you can poach them and pay them and get whatever people in the building that you want to. It's a lot easier to get someone to change, firms than it's to get someone to change teams in a collectively bargained sport with all these rules. So you have to wait for the right executive to come up. And he really talked about that patience and the fact that that seat is vacant. And in the past, he has spoken about the president being open, but that he could be looking for a president to run the business side of things. And I'll tell you what, if the New York Mets this season were in first place, contending with the Braves, and every move that Billy Epler made was working out incredibly well, I imagine he wouldn't be speaking so much about a president of baseball operations. But now he is. Because the idea is to get someone that can work with Billy, but also over Billy. And so I think that was a major, major takeaway, is that the Mets are going to have all their eggs in the David Stearns basket. And there's a chance that Stearns could go take a job at the Astros too. But I don't think that Cohen's going to be outbid on David Stearns when he finally has an opportunity to try to hire him, because that contract with the Brewers, which he already resigned from his post, but he's still, unable to interview until the end of this season. When that happens, I imagine you could see him come in. I could imagine David Stearns bringing his own manager, and the Mets looking a lot different next season. So the sweeping changes that Mets fans are hoping for, maybe that comes in the offseason, because maybe this is just a lost year. That's what we're going to get to next. It's starting to feel that way. Cohen kind of acknowledged that potential reality and the direction the Mets could go, and he put a lot of responsibility on his players to change that. And so I want to go through the rest of my takeaways and how it relates to all those things in just a minute. Before we do, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. If you've ever been in a situation where you're trying to go to the game, but you need last-minute tickets, Gametime is a fast and easy way where you can buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you with killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, so you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for all the fun you're going to have at the game. The Gametime guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section in a row for less, Gametime's going to credit you 110% of the difference. The fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Get images of your seats before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps. You're all set. Tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you never have to dig through your email. You can snag tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. The New York Mets played the Milwaukee Brewers 7:10 Eastern Time tonight. Catch every pitch of the Mets' hometown broadcast with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. Looking over my top 5 biggest takeaways from Steve Cohen's press conference on JustBaseball.com. Number 1 was no one's getting fired midseason. Number 2 was David Stern's about to get a massive check. That brings us to number 3, which was responsibility for losing lies with the players, which seems obvious, but when a lot of us were scapegoating Buck Showalter or Billy Epler, and they certainly have a big, part in what's happened so far. The reality is the players haven't performed. And if you looked at the team on paper, as all of us did going into the season, even without Edwin Diaz, you felt like they had the pieces to contend. When they were, whatever it was, 14-7, I think it was the record through 21 games, which feels so long ago. I'm not sure if I had that nailed down exactly, but they did get off to a good start this year. We weren't saying, oh, it was Showalter and Epler. The players have been the ones who haven't performed, and Cohen was pretty honest about that, but he didn't do it in a way where he was pinpointing one guy or scapegoating a particular player or group of players. He said what I think all of us have said, and what I've said in this podcast many a time. It seems like it's just not our year. When our pitching's good, our hitting's not. When our hitting's good, our pitching's not. And in some way, ease that burden of responsibility while still putting it squarely on his players. And essentially made it clear that, look, if the Mets have to be sellers at the deadline, they're going to be. They have to look at the future outlook of this team. They can't blindly just keep pushing chips into the center of the table. At some point, the hand becomes so overwhelmingly against you that you have to fold. He doesn't want to do that, though. That's clear. And he did put some pressure on the players. Like, you got this time until the deadline. Prove that you can hang in this race. And as I wrote the article, I counted, there was 25 games until the deadline. They just lost one of them. Okay, now you're 0-1 in this 25-game stretch where the Mets probably have to win 17 games, something crazy like that, at least 15. And then you just have to see what the race looks like to know what the Mets will do. But the responsibility does lie with the players, and we'll see if they can put it together. And I'll talk about the game in the next segment. When you have the bases loaded, nobody out, you got to put up more than a run. And the Mets didn't do that tonight, and they lost. And Adam Ottavino said it best after the game. He said, good teams find a way to overcome these things, and we aren't overcoming them. I mean, I think it's starting to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a bad baseball team. Even though the talent is there, it's not gelling. And so, what could happen, and this leads to my fourth takeaway, is from biggest buyer to unprecedented seller. What we've seen with Steve Cohen is a pattern lately. We started with James McCann this offseason, eat $19 million or $24 million owed to him, and you get a player to be named later, and you're able to get anything, really, and get his contract and get his roster spot off the books without just outright cutting him by trading him to the Orioles. He was an untradeable player, we thought. Eats the money to get off of it, right? Eduardo Escobar has little value. A platoon bat that's barely playing, making $9.5 million. At $9.5 million, Eduardo Escobar costs a prospect to get off that money to some teams. And that's harsh to say, but or bare minimum, you're not getting anything back. You're trading him for cash. And maybe not even. Like, there's not a trade if you don't eat the money. The Mets eat the money, they get 2 prospects. So that's going to be the mode of operation. Steve Cohen said that he views the money spent on payroll as a sunk cost already, which is refreshing because we know that if the Wilpons were selling, they were selling to keep money in the bank account. They weren't selling to add to the farm. That's the big difference. So imagine what Max Scherzer is worth as a vet minimum to a contender. If Steve Cohen eats whatever's left on that contract, I believe it was, someone said something like $12 million or something after the deadline. If he eats that remaining money, you could trade Max Scherzer and get something. Now, here's the thing. The Mets might want Scherzer and Verlander for next season. I don't know. he did also mention that if this is going nowhere, does it make sense to bring back the same veteran team a year older? So again, it's putting pressure on these players. You guys want to play together. You guys want to contend. You want to win here. Do it. Put up or shut up. And maybe the Mets do. Maybe the Mets rise to the challenge. And look, they were 8.5 back when the presser happened today. I don't know if it's 9 now. I haven't checked the standings, but if the Mets get this at 3 games, 4 games out by the deadline, I don't think they have to make all of the way back. If they get it within spitting distance, I could see them just holding. I don't know if they would buy in that situation, but I could see them holding. I could see them just saying, you know what? We're going to keep Scherzer. We're going to keep Verlander. Maybe you trade a Tommy Pham, who's having a great season. Hit a home run again tonight. Got a couple hits. Maybe you cash in on him now because he's not your team next year. And you eat the $6 million. You get a really nice player back. Maybe you do the same for Mark Canha. Maybe because the catching market's thin and there's a lot of teams that need catching, you find a suitor for Omar Narvaez. Like, there are players that you could move that wouldn't drastically shift your chances this year if you were 3 or 4 back and could net you some prospects. And you don't trade for anything because you're not going to waste. And I also don't think that it's smart to take on bad contracts for a loser. And that's what this team has been. Now, if they reel off 17 of the next 24 games before the deadline, they go 17-7, and they're a game out of the wild card spot at the deadline, maybe you do take on a bad contract and not give up prospects, but still try to win this year. That's kind of the different paths they could go. It's either you're way out of the race, which the way they're trending, they're going to be 14, 15 games out, and it's going to be clear. Eat all the money and trade them all. If you can get something great for Scherzer and Verlander, just do it. The problem with that, though, is then you have to try to build a rotation for next year. So there is a balance. Maybe you trade a Scherzer, but you keep a Verlander. But that's where the Mets are at here. And yes, they could trade David Robertson if they wanted to. If Adam Ottavino pitches a little better, maybe they could trade him, Brooks Raley. I mean, there are pieces that can be moved, and the prospect return could be fantastic. If this goes sideways, and maybe that's the best thing for this franchise, and the Mets flip Tommy Pham, Mark Canha, hell, even Starling Marte. Imagine you're the Marlins, and you have a guy that was awesome for you in your last push. One of 3 times in franchise history you've made the playoffs. 2020 was a COVID season, but hey, it's still important to that franchise. And you can trade Starling Marte, or you can acquire Starling Marte where it's not going to cost you anything this season. And on the final 2 years of his deal, Steve Cohen eats half. The Mets could get a significant pitching prospect back in return for that. Because for that team, getting a center fielder might just be, or if they want to put him in right, whatever it is, that might be worth it to them. So there are a lot of options that the Mets could go to if this turns into a seller. My last takeaway was the one I opened with, which is the Mets are in great hands with Steve Cohen. And I think that's self-explanatory. The money he's spending, not only on the payroll, but on the infrastructure in the minor leagues, is going to pay dividends in the future. And if you just get a very good executive in here, and David Stearns presided over arguably the best run of success in Milwaukee Brewers franchise history. He has been an absolute winner as an executive. If he has the keys to this franchise after this season with Cohen's resources and the talent that is still in place, because you're looking at Brandon Nimmo this year, he is proving worth that contract. I think Edwin Diaz, no one's really concerned about what he's going to be when he comes back. Lindor, still one of the best shortstops in baseball. You got Pete Alonso. You probably have your catcher of the future, Francisco Alvarez. Brett Beatty, even though it's been up and down, he looks like there are pieces here. So I look at the future of this franchise, and I'm still optimistic. I look at the reality of this season. It's very hard to be, and that's what we're going to discuss next. I'm going to go over another agonizing Mets loss, as it felt like there was a chance to really garner some momentum here coming off of a win last night and the Cohen presser, and the team fell flat once again. So we're going to discuss what happened in just a minute. First, another word from our sponsors. The New York Mets play the Milwaukee Brewers again at 7:10 Eastern time tonight. Catch every pitch of the Mets' hometown broadcast with Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. Look, I thought some momentum was building. I had a little bit of optimism on yesterday's show, and it's maybe just my consistent glass half full approach. And probably it's because selfishly, I want to see something made of this season. And so you cling to any glimmer of hope. And so the idea that Steve Cohen's going to meet with the media, then you roll out and you play your crispest, best game in weeks. You got Kodai Senga and Scherzer to close out the series. It's not a good Brewers team. It's like, all right, win this series. Win a series so that going into one weekend, you don't think that this season's lost. You think, okay, maybe there's some hope. Because again, as much as it would be crazy for the New York Mets to be contenders this season, if they ever got their act together and won 9 out of 10 games, the reality of a 3-team wildcard race, particularly in the National League, is you can get back in the mix. So I thought, all right, it's going to happen. There's momentum. Cohen's putting some pressure on the players. Maybe they're going to rise to the challenge. And in the first inning, the Mets are losing 2-0. And look, Kodai Senga did not pitch bad in this game. Okay? He didn't. He gave up a double to lead things off to Yelich. He got 2 strikeouts. He walked a batter. He gave up another double. He got out of the inning. And then he put up 4 zeros. And he got 8 strikeouts. And at least he got you through 5. You need him to get through 6 because that's the barometer if the Mets are going to win. If they get 6 innings from the starting pitcher, they win. They don't, they lose pretty much. At least that's what it felt like, and that's what the numbers pretty much show us this year. A 2-0 hole is a gut punch. Now, Tommy Pham homers in the second, so you cut that deficit in half. Then in the 4th inning, the Brewers are ready to hand you the game on a platter. Here, Mets, here you go. It's all yours. They walk Lindor. Wade Miley does. Gives up a base hit to Alonso, walks Tommy Pham to load the bases. Francisco Alvarez draws a walk with the bases loaded. Tie ball game. Bases juiced. No outs. All you need is a soft ground ball that they can't turn 2 on. Hell, hit into a double play, Brett Beatty. At least the Mets would have a lead. A sacrifice fly. Anything. The only thing you can't do is get called out on strikes. And he does. Was there a bad strike call on that at bat? Who cares? And it wasn't that one, by the way. Maybe Beatty should have been sitting 3. I'm looking at the pitches right now. Yeah, he probably should have been sitting 3-1 instead of 2-2, but you can't get called looking on a 93-mile-per-hour fastball in the outside corner. You got to put bat on ball in that spot. The base is loaded, nobody out to just break a tie. Then Mark Hanna comes up and hits into a double play ball. Again, the last thing that you can possibly do in a 2-2 count. Yes, he put the ball in play the only way you're not supposed to. And the Mets don't score again in that game. And that's it. That's the whole ball game. Now, we could talk about the relief pitching. We could talk about the fact that there's no one in this bullpen you can trust outside of Grant Hartwig. Or outside Grant Hartwig, jeez. Man, I am beaten down clearly from this Mets season if I think Grant Hartwig's the only hope. Outside of David Robertson, I was getting to the fact that Grant Hartwig comes in to relieve Senga and gives up a run in the lead immediately. But you're only losing by 1, and then you get to where baseball just isn't fair for the Mets this season. And look, it's not an excuse because the Mets still probably lose 3-2, but you have a batter fully swing, and he gets hit by a pitch, but he fully swung, hit his hands on a swing. He was clearly fooled. The bat goes all the way around, and he's awarded first base. And then right after, the Brewers get a base hit that scores a couple, and Buck Showalter is thrown out of the game for arguing the previous, mistake from the umpiring crew. It's just another moment that makes you think that this team's going nowhere, though, basically. And Adam Ottavino, who's on the mound for it, is the one after the game that's saying, again, Good teams overcome these hurdles and we haven't, or whatever the exact quote was. I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially it. That the Mets were a good team, they'd be overcoming these things, and clearly they haven't been a good team. So at least Scherzer's on the mound for the final game of this series. You could squeak out a split and he can boost his trade value. The Mets are running out of time. It's that simple. You got about a month. Because also there's a week off for the All-Star break. And the Mets need a break, but they also need to play games to get back in this thing before the deadline. Cohen put the responsibility on the players. There's not going to be a manager fired. So let's watch the next month and see what these players do. Otherwise, we're going to be talking about the youth movement. I guess that's the one silver lining in all of this. We can all watch Mark Vientos after the trade deadline every day. Speaking of every day, thank you to all you everydayers for always tuning in. I'll be breaking down the final game of this series and previewing what lies ahead on tomorrow's show. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you want to catch every pitch of the Mets hometown broadcast, you can do so with Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search Mets.